Hey everyone, welcome back to Portal of Wisdom. I am back today with another story for you. And man, I have found some really good stories lately. They've been a lot of fun to do the research and put together. So I found a story, and it's a really good one with a lot of intrigue and suspense, but I cannot tell absolutely for certain if it is true or not. But it's too good not to tell anyhow. So some say that it's totally true, and some say that it's just a great campfire tale. And it has a lot of twists and turns in it, so it's definitely one of those that you want to listen until the end. It is one of the biggest legends of the Canadian Rockies, so it's, like I said, too good not to tell, and it's super interesting. And it's from the 1870s. So, from some of the very early days of people being in the Canadian Rockies, at least for, the white prospectors and stuff. Of course, the Native Americans have been in these areas for, way longer than that, of course. But it first appeared in print in the 1940s. But this could be explained away as this area of this possible gold mine was so rugged and desolate that there would be no towns anywhere near this location for at least a couple more decades after it was supposedly discovered, or maybe even longer before towns really started to pop up with enough people in them that they would maybe have a newspaper. So if there are no newspapers in the area for a long time, then there's generally probably going to be not much to report on such a find for many years. And that could have been the case here. So enjoy listening to the end. There's a lot of crazy things that happen in this story. So in the winter of 1870, there was an expedition that was funded by a rich prospector and investor named Lafayette French. And Mr. French had paid for an expedition of men to go into the Canadian Rockies to look for gold on his behalf. And on this trip, they were on the North Saskatchewan River in western Alberta. And this group of men were experienced outdoorsmen and prospectors. So they were told if they found gold on this expedition that they would be cut in for a part of the profits. So this gentleman named Lafayette French had outfitted this group and supplied them with everything that they needed to go into the mountains and to look for potential gold or gold mine locations for him. And if they found a good mine location, Lafayette likely would have become very rich, and the men on the expedition hoped that they would also do fairly well for themselves too. So it's not said exactly how many men were on the expedition, but it appears that it was noted to be somewhere around a dozen or so. They were riding horses along various rivers and through the mountains looking for gold, and on this trip were two men named Frank Lemon and another man that went by the name or the nickname Blackjack. So initially, Frank thought this would be a great opportunity and had convinced his friend Blackjack to join him on this expedition. But after a while, they had been in the Canadian wilderness for weeks and no one had found anything. So they were getting tired and they were just thinking about going home. And Frank found himself losing interest and losing focus, and I guess it was the same for Blackjack at this point. So they constantly found themselves at the back of the pack, and it seems at this point the rest of the expedition would leave Frank Lemon and Blackjack quite a ways behind in the dust. And at one point, Frank and Blackjack were a little ways behind the pack, and Frank found himself in a daze or daydreaming or zoning out. Now, we've all done that when we haven't been interested in something. And as he was doing this, and kind of staring off into the forest as he rode along, he noticed a tiny little dirt trail winding off in the distance away from the river that they were following. And he started to think how the group was just concentrating on following the rivers, and that he thought maybe they were missing some real opportunities down one of these mountain trails. And at this point, Frank paused for a minute with his friend Blackjack, and they stared down this little winding trail. And Frank decided to tell the leader of the group that maybe they should look down some of these trails and explore away from the rivers. But when he looked ahead, he realized that the group at this point had left them far behind. So he realized that the group didn't stop when he stopped to look down the trail, and it appears at this point that they just decided that the group had already left them behind, and so maybe himself and Blackjack should go ahead and explore down this little winding mountain trail themselves. And at this point, Blackjack agreed, and it seemed like he also felt the same way, and also they felt like they didn't really fit into this group very well. So the two of them took their horses down this narrow, winding mountain path, and they rode deeper and deeper into the forest for hours. And at this point, the rest of the group would be miles and miles away. So they didn't really know where the trail was going, but they felt a powerful feeling to continue to follow this trail. It was like it was calling to them. And as they neared the end of the trail, they were hearing weird whispers and noises and footsteps in the woods all around them. But they never saw anything or anyone that could account for these noises that may have made them, wonder what they were hearing and imagining things. Or maybe it was all in their heads from the long time that they had been in the woods. But it was said that this trail was apparently an old Native American trail, and it led south through the mountains along the Highwood River and up into the mountains. So the pair of prospectors ended up somewhere near Crow's Nest Pass in southwest Alberta. Somewhere in this area, they began to prospect a little creek. This particular spot they were prospecting was just downriver from a spot where 3 creeks had emptied into this creek. And as they checked their gold pans, they found some showings of gold. So apparently it was not a lot, but it was a good sign nonetheless. So they realized that the gold could be coming downriver from any one of these other 3 creeks that dumped into this creek that they were panning. So they picked one of the creeks and they followed it upstream near its headwaters. And it was near this spot that they accidentally discovered a rich gold ledge in the little creek of water, and the water was pouring over this little ledge with a kind of a golden waterfall ledge, gold behind this little waterfall. And the gold ledge appeared to have one of the purest gold veins that they had ever seen. The gold vein was so pure and rich, and it had massive nuggets that had been worn off and were in the little basin of the waterfall below, and they appeared to just be lumps of pure gold. So the discovery appeared to be worth millions. Now, it was said at the time that Frank and Blackjack found this ledge of gold, they were also being watched from afar by 2 Stoney or Nakota Native American tribesmen. Frank and Blackjack were oblivious to this fact that they were being watched. And on their mind right now was what they should do about their find. They had to decide if they wanted to make a permanent camp here and try to mine this gold ledge in this not so great winter conditions at this time of year, or if they should come back in the spring when the weather was a bit better and they could have more mining supplies and probably not battle the elements, and they could bring all this stuff to this particular site. So it seems that they had a discussion about this, and exactly what happened here is still up for a little bit of debate. Some sources say that Blackjack actually wanted to let Lafayette French know about their find, as they were initially on an expedition for him, and Blackjack didn't really want to lie about it. Other sources say Blackjack wanted to sleep on it and decide what to do the next day, as he was really torn with what they should do. It seems that Frank wanted to make camp and pull a lot of gold out right then and there. And it seems as they would be doing that, Frank would be trying to make more of a long-term plan, but he wanted to extract a lot of gold initially. So they had abandoned the expedition, and Frank wanted to keep this gold location for the two of them. And this would, of course, require keeping it a secret from Lafayette French and the rest of the expedition. So that evening, Blackjack went into the woods to collect some firewood while Frank set up the tent. And as Frank set up the tent, he began to again hear whispers and light voices and other noises in the woods again. And it was the same whispers and voices and all this weird stuff that he was hearing as they had approached this location, and it made Frank very uneasy. He started to think that maybe the group that they had abandoned had caught up to them and had found them and would now discover their fantastic gold discovery. So Frank looked all around in the woods, and he found no one. Maybe it was all in his head, or he thought maybe he heard Blackjack in the woods. And it seemed the noises were coming from all over the woods. So at one point, Frank looked around for Blackjack just to confirm the noises weren't coming from him. Then he spotted Blackjack in the opposite side of the woods from where he realized he was hearing these noises coming from at the moment. So he knew it was not Blackjack. Frank had a very uneasy feeling about everything. Something just did not feel right, but he couldn't put his finger on it, and there wasn't really anything he could do about it. So they set up camp for the night, and they made a fire, and they had some discussion around the campfire, and it was said that the campfire discussion became very heated, and the men were not agreeing upon what they were going to do, and Frank got extremely heated, and especially by the fact that his friend Blackjack would not agree with him at the moment. So Frank couldn't sleep that night and was pacing by the campfire, and it seems at some point during the night, Frank's opinion of what he needed to do had changed. It seems that one point of Frank's rage, or once he got to the point of being extremely hot-headed or upset, that he decided what he needed to do. So his rage had built up to the point where now he actually thought that Blackjack was going to be an obstacle for him and his ability to keep this gold. And he had these morbid thoughts continue to swirl in his head, and he started to think that he needed to prevent Blackjack from telling anyone. And his rage became very amped up at this point, and he felt that he needed to get rid of his problem then and there. And he saw only one way to do that, and he could not control himself, as at this point he worked himself into a blind rage, and he took his axe and he went into the tent, and it was said that he buried it into his sleeping friend's head. So as Frank sat back down by the campfire, realizing what he had just done, he started to hear more moans and whispers and voices and all of these weird noises in the woods again. This time it sounded like a dying animal. The moaning sounds got louder and louder, but Frank could find nothing around them that would be causing these noises. And of course, he checked on his dead friend in the tent, and the noises were definitely not coming from him. Then he said he heard noises that told him that he was going to pay for what he did, or he heard some kind of a voice that whispered or said that. Then a few moments later, all the voices and whispers and moans all stopped. Now it seemed there was a deadly silence that seemed to be just ominous as he sat there. Then out of the silence came a high-pitched scream. That was enough for Frank, and he hopped on his horse and he fled as fast as he could away from this location. And as he galloped away on the horse, he started hearing the whispers and voices that seemed to be right behind him. He couldn't make himself turn around to look and see if something was behind him. While Frank eventually made it out of the woods, in I guess the middle of the night, I believe he made it out of the woods. It's not said how many days he had to ride, but it is said that he ended up in a little town, and this little town was the same town that the whole expedition team had left out of many weeks earlier. And apparently they had spent some time in this town outfitting and preparing and getting ready to go out when he was part of the big group. Now, it seems that this town was very likely in Montana, as there really were not any towns of any size hardly at all in this area of Alberta at this time. The other Alberta towns of okay size nowadays didn't exist at that point, like Medicine Hat, Lethbridge, and Calgary. They didn't exist for quite some time at this point of the story. So it seems likely the town was in Montana, as it was said that the expedition did leave out of Montana to begin with. So there is another little offshoot of this story from the woods that comes from the Native American stories. And it states that the Native Americans, the Lakota people, or the Stony people as they were also known, were watching them and had seen what Frank did to Blackjack, and they had reported it to their chief Bear's Paw. And it seems possible that the Native Americans could have been responsible for some of the noises and voices in the woods, possibly. So it was also said that Chief Bear's Paw told the two Native Americans that witnessed all of this to be quiet and to keep it a secret, as he did not want a bunch more people on their land, which would definitely happen once word got out of gold to the general public. So it was also said that the chief had put a curse on the gold at this point. Frank was afraid of what he had done in the woods, and he found the closest church that he could find. But it was still the middle of the night when he got into this little town, like we said, likely in Montana. So he sat outside of this church and he waited for a priest to show up in the morning. Once the priest showed up, Frank begged the priest to free him from the ghost of Blackjack that he figured was following him and whispering and causing a lot of the noises he was hearing. And it was haunting him, so he confessed everything to the priest, even the very rich gold ledge that they had found. The thoughts and confessions of Frank just spilled out of him, and the priest had to slow him down to recount all of these details at a much slower pace so that he could understand everything. So the priest had him go over all of the details step by step to get to the location where Blackjack's body would be. It seems at this point the priest decided that Frank was telling the truth and was not a madman. But Frank had just confessed to murder, and at this point, the priest was actually only focusing on the gold and its location. It seemed all of a sudden there was a dark cloud hanging over the priest, and he became greedy and he wanted to know where the gold was. So the priest told Frank that he needed to get out of town and not come back, and they would sort things out later, but he could not be here right now. He said, "They will find Blackjack, and we will give him a proper burial." And Frank felt a weight lifted off of his chest, and it was said that he headed south somewhere to join some family members. At this point, it seemed like the priest was really interested in the gold and not necessarily Blackjack's body. There are other stories that state that Frank came back but could never make himself go back into those woods. Soon after Frank's confession, the priest found one of his outdoorsman friends named John McDougal, and he asked him to head off into the wilderness to try to find this campsite and to bury the body and to look for the rich gold ledge. And he provided John McDougal with all of the details of the location from the confession. And it was said that the priest friend John was able to use the location details to actually find the campsite, and he found Blackjack. And he dug a hole nearby, and he buried Blackjack, and he put a lot of large rocks on top of the grave to mark the location. It seems the priest and his friend John were planning to keep the gold mine location for themselves. But when John returned back to report to the priest that he had buried Blackjack, he also mentioned all of these weird whispers and moans and noises in the woods, and it really creeped him out. He had become paranoid while in the woods. But of course, he too looked all around him, and he could find nothing that accounted for any of these noises. At times they would become louder and feel like they were right on top of him, but there was nothing there. And John was an avid outdoorsman, so the fact that he brought this up to the priest must have meant that it was very unsettling to him. John mentioned to the priest that he did find the gold location near the campsite, and this made the priest excited. But John was starting to feel like the location near the campsite and the woods around there must be haunted or have some ominous presence to them. So the priest wanted John to go back into the woods with some more supplies and bring some of this gold out. But this time, John didn't want to go alone, so he gathered up a couple of friends to go with him. So John led this group of a few men down the narrow wooded trail towards the location of the gold. And as they went through these woods, they again heard the voices and the whispers again, and the men got a little uneasy. When they arrived at the campsite, he could not believe what he saw. When he had buried Blackjack, he had used some pretty large rocks to mark the grave. Those rocks were all gone now. And the bloody tent was also now missing. It looked like just about every bit of evidence that there had ever been a campsite here had been erased. There was an eerie presence among them, and all the men fled from this site. When John got back to town, he didn't report to the priest. Instead, he reported directly to the bar, and he started drinking heavily. It was said that John actually died of alcohol poisoning just a couple of days later. It seemed that the priest wasn't concerned about the death of his friend John, and he prepared to go into the woods himself. So some stories state that the priest did not go back out into the woods again to look for the gold until 1883, close to 10 years later. The priest gathered up a horse and some other supplies, and he made his way down the trails that he had noted from Frank's confession. And of course, this is many years later, but When he got to the narrow trail, it seemed that that part of the forest had recently had a forest fire, and it was difficult to tell where there may have been a narrow trail that may have gone off into the woods from this river. It was said that Lafayette French, the rich investor that paid for the initial expedition, had heard stories of the gold ledge at some point. And French had hired a guide to take him out into this area. And rumors of the haunted woods and creepy things going on in these woods had spread around the area quite quickly. But Lafayette French ignored all of those stories, and it was said that the man that Lafayette French had hired to guide him in the woods had mysteriously died on his way to meet up with Lafayette to guide him into the woods. It seemed to be another casualty of this curse on this gold ledge. It was also said that the man he had tried to hire to lead him into the woods was actually none other than John McDougall. But if it was John, then it had to be quickly after the initial discovery, as John did not live long after the initial discovery or after he came back. If so, he may have been on a paid expedition by Lafayette, or he may have been reporting back to the priest, or possibly he was playing both sides of the fence here and maybe getting money to go out on this expedition from the priest, and also may have been on an expedition for Lafayette French. In which case, we know once John got back, he didn't live more than a couple of days, so he wasn't able to report to Lafayette and guide him into the woods. So it was said that Lafayette looked for this gold ledge himself for 30 plus years. And after 30 years, it was said that he finally found it, and he had written a letter to a friend or a family member letting them know that he found the gold ledge finally. The next thing we knew, Lafayette's cabin had burned to the ground with him in it, and he did not survive. Apparently only the letter survived that the relative had. So it appears that he may have found the gold ledge, but then not lived long enough to profit from it. So it seems that almost everyone who may have found the gold ledge didn't live long enough after finding it. Now, I believe it was said that Frank made his way all the way down to Texas where he had some family, and he never returned to the area. And there are other stories that said he eventually may have came back to the area. Now, there could be a few more logical explanations for things. According to the stories by the Stoney Native American tribe, also known as the Nakota people, they were aware of what was going on at this location, and they were watching it from afar. And their chief, like we had mentioned earlier, did not want them to turn in Frank for killing his friend, and they may have sent some of the tribe to get rid of the campsite and the evidence and anyone that may have been buried near there, which could also keep any other people from stumbling across an old campsite and then using it and then discovering the gold themselves. So the Native Americans could also have been responsible for the voices that were heard in the woods and could have been whispering and screaming and making noises to scare people away. We don't really know here. It's said that some people believe that the gold location is near the Montana-Saskatchewan border, and many more people believe it's actually inside the Crow's Nest Volcanics in southwestern Alberta, somewhere near Crow's Nest Pass and the Highwood River. But this area is very remote and mountainous and densely forested and has lots of cliffs of 1,000 feet or more, lots of rock falls and snow and ice, and so many more obstacles that could be helping to hide this location. It also should be noted that the distance between Crow's Nest Pass and the Highwood River is probably some 35 miles or more on the map, and this area would be excruciatingly difficult to search. So this legend was said to spur two false gold rushes, one in 1931 and one in 1988. So I found details on that, and I don't know what they mean by false gold rushes. If people thought they found this and then it was discovered that it wasn't this, or people found some other gold on a creek but it was discovered that it wasn't this particular mine. Anyhow, that was what one source said. So to this day, the lost lemon mine has not been found, and it very well could be still out there. This area is extremely rugged and desolate. So that is the story of the lost lemon mine. So I don't know what your thoughts are on this story. I know I kind of have my opinions on it, and this story has grown to mythical proportions in the Canadian Rockies, and it's been out there for a long time, and like I said earlier on, it didn't appear in print until I think around 1940. But a lot of these areas really didn't have towns of decent size for a long time after this story. So the story not appearing in newspapers in the 1800s, late 1800s or something like that is probably not super surprising there. But it does seem to me that if the Native Americans were watching over this area and knew that there was gold in this area and they knew what could happen, and they had some people in the woods there watching what was going on, it seems to me that they very well could have been responsible for a lot of the noises and the removal of the campsite and the removal of the body and all the big boulders that marked the grave and all of that stuff. It could have been the Native Americans that came back and tried to erase this area from being able to be easily discovered by anybody coming along here. And in which case, those details to me seem to make sense. And so it doesn't seem like it would just be a total fairy tale. Now, it could be something that was made up for around the campfire, but it seems like there are people that did hear this story, and it can be traced to the Native Americans that had this story in some of their oral tellings that matched up with some details that the priest knew, and that John, before John McDougall died, he may have shared some details. And also Frank Lemon doesn't die in this story, so a lot of these details at some point could have come from Frank Lemon, but he was too scared to go back into the woods and try to find this location or face up to what he did out there. So it's not like every source dies here, and there were people along the way that definitely could have gotten a lot of the details, and especially Frank. So maybe the spooky woods were the Native Americans making noises and watching over what happened, and it could definitely be out there. This area is super remote. So that's kind of my thoughts on this. I don't know if I should share my thoughts or not. Sometimes maybe it's just good for everyone to be able to speculate. But you can leave your thoughts in the comments. If you have opinions one way or another of what you think might have happened, definitely leave it in the comments. It's fun to see other people's viewpoints and their thoughts. Thanks for listening all the way to the end, and thanks for supporting the channel.